Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Holland. I'm Associate Dean for the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters, and among my jobs is the considerable pleasure every year of organising the Saturday Scholars series. Since this is the last event in the series, I want to make one particular thank you. And as she walks past, I want to thank Anne Noel and her staff, who each home game organised this. Anne and her staff do an extraordinary and typically self-effacing job to make sure this runs smoothly, whatever the demands we put upon them. And we also video these sessions, and they go up on the Arts and Letters website after a short while. So if there's anything you missed or you'd like to revisit, please do go and explore it. Normally, at this point, I mentioned the remaining games, but there are no remaining games. I have to say, it's wonderful, and it can't only be the result of the weather to see so many people here. But it's also slightly intimidating. I'm used to looking out in the front rows at a sea of green and of Irish supporters, instead of which we have this large contingent from Utah Valley University, for a reason I'll explain in a moment. Don't be too hard on me. So, the panel's title is clear. Let me just say very briefly a few words about each of the speakers. First is David Campbell. David has a problem today because while he's here as a professor, he was an undergraduate at BYU. So he's had a certain amount of divided loyalties, and I think the answer is, whatever the result this afternoon, he both wins and loses. He's Professor of Political Science and the founding director of the Rooney Center for American Democracy. And he's the author with Robert Putnam of American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us, published in 2010 to huge acclaim. He has a book forthcoming called Seeking the Promised Land, Mormons and American Politics. In spite of the label, the next speaker is actually Phillip Muñoz. It's his fault for never correcting what appears on the university's website, that he appears as Vincent P. Muñoz. And he too, he is an associate professor, sorry, let me turn over the right page, in the Department of Political Science. And he came to Notre Dame in 2009. He is a busy person. He is director both of the Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and Public Life, and also the director of Notre Dame's brand new undergraduate minor in Constitutional Studies. The third speaker certainly needs no introduction to the people in front. This is, I think, the first time that we've had as a speaker at a Saturday Scholars event somebody who is not on the faculty at Notre Dame. And I'm extremely pleased that my namesake, but no relation, Matt Holland, is here. Matt is, as all of you know, president of Utah Valley University, a post he's held since 2009. He was an associate professor of political science at Brigham Young, which is also where he was an undergraduate. He's, apart from anything else, and I can't believe that a president of a university still finds time to do this, an extraordinarily fine teacher, which his commitment to applied learning concepts led to his selection back in 2008 as BYU's Civically Engaged Scholar of the Year. And I think as all universities find how they can connect with their communities, that's an award which speaks a great deal of his work. His book, Bonds of Affection, Civic Charity and the Making of America, was published in 2007. Let me invite our three speakers to come to the platform. Thank you. Better give you back the mic.
We're going to switch up the order. I'm Peter. I'm the Vincent Phillip Muñoz who's going to go first. When the dean's office asked the political science department if we might be interested in doing a Saturday Scholars weekend talk on this weekend, we jumped at the chance. We very much appreciate the invitation for the department as a whole. And I suggested to Dean Holland, given that it's a BYU game, let's do something on Romney and the election. In fact, there's a question I was interested in, did Romney's Mormonism cost him the White House? And I asked my colleague Dave Campbell, who I thought if I wanted to talk to anyone in the department about that question, it would be Dave. And I said, well, Dave, why don't you do it, and let's ask Matt Holland. I mean, what a great panel. And I told Peter, if you put this panel together, we'll get a large crowd. Even I'd give up tailgating to go. And so I was a bit surprised a week ago when I saw the posters that I was on the panel. That's not actually what I meant. I was anticipating being with you. So I'll just be honest. I have no idea if it cost him the White House. I'm tempted just to stop right now. So I thought what I'd actually do is maybe provide a little bit of context and compare the way that Romney tried to preempt criticism or anticipate criticism of his candidacy in 2007, actually, when he didn't win the Republican nomination. He gave a very prominent speech, and that speech was imitated or followed on the speech that President Kennedy gave when he was running for the presidency in 1960. And I thought, given the anniversary of Kennedy's passing, I could compare those two speeches just very briefly and maybe give a little context for them what will follow. Before I do that, I just want to take a moment of sort of family pride here. My brother is here for his very first Notre Dame game. Very pleased that he's here, and it's because he's about to turn 50 years old. So happy birthday, Paul, and thank you for coming. Okay, could you flip to the next slide? So there's some similarities between what Romney did in 2007 and what President Kennedy did in 1960. They both talked about a candidate should not be disqualified on account of religion, right? That was the dominant theme of Kennedy's speech, and I have just a few quotations here, right? I believe in America where no man is denied public office merely because of his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him, right? It says, I'm the Catholic candidate. I'm not the Catholic candidate. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president who happens to be Catholic. Romney took a very similar approach, and he referenced Kennedy's speech, right? Almost 50 years ago, another candidate from Massachusetts explained that he was an American running for president, not a Catholic running for president. Like him, I'm an American running for president. Right? I do not define my candidacy by my religion. So a candidate, they both strove to make the point that a candidate should not be disqualified on account of his religious affiliation. A second similarity. If a person of faith should win election, they should exercise their constitutional duties in the national interest, right? Now, of course, this was one of the leading criticisms of Kennedy, of course, was that he would have divided loyalties. Would he be answering to the Pope? Would the Pope be calling him up to tell him what to do? Right. So Kennedy was at pains to say, no. Whatever subject comes before me, and he mentions birth control, a quintessentially Catholic topic. I'll do what's in the national interest. Right. And Romney said something similar. Right. Right. I assure you, no authorities of my church or any church for that matter will exert influence on presidential decisions, right? So there's some real similarities, and I think, I don't know this, but I'm sure Romney, in crafting his speech, started with Kennedy's text because they clearly parallel one another. What's interesting is that, while there are these parallels, there's some real differences as well, right? You maybe go to the next one, right? Kennedy was at pains to say, look, religion is a private matter, right? I believe in a president whose religious views are his own private affair, right? It doesn't really matter what my religious views are. Whereas Romney, and this happens right at the beginning of his speech, took a very different tack, right? He says, I want to offer a perspective on how my own faith would inform my presidency, right? Much more than Kennedy, Romney embraced his faith. For the next one, right? This quote from Kennedy is somewhat striking today, right? I believe in America where there's no Catholic vote, no anti-Catholic vote, no voting bloc of any kind. It's not absolutely clear what he means by that. But it seems to mean that, individuals' religious commitments don't really matter in how they vote, how they act, how they think about politics. Sort of shocking for the time, right? Now, Romney embraced religion, right? He says, freedom requires religion just as religion requires freedom, right? And so, we might have differences in theology, right? We share a common creed of moral convictions. Now, maybe that's what Kennedy meant. But Romney, much more than Kennedy, right, embraced religion in general, right? In fact, he was criticized so much for saying, well, what about atheists, right? And then maybe one. Okay, so let me leave it here. What does this teach us as difference, right? I think I must have left out a slide where Kennedy says, I believe in the absolute separation of church and state. And he goes so far as to say, even no money for parochial schools, no public money for parochial schools, right? He obviously means Catholic schools, right? We'll keep religion out of politics. Romney takes a much different tact, right? No, we should embrace religious faith as a people. In fact, our faith is what preserves our freedom, right? Obviously, that difference is a big question in American politics today. To what extent should religious faith guide at all our politics? To what extent should the state be supportive of religion, or at least acknowledge religion? That's a question we could spend much time on. Let me just a few things in conclusion, to get to these guys, on how the lessons we drew from Kennedy's address compared to the lessons we might draw from Romney's address. Kennedy's speech was largely defensive. He tells us not why we should vote for him because he's Catholic, but rather we should vote for him despite his Catholicism. He doesn't give us a single reason to vote for him because he's Catholic. At most, his religion is a private affair that shouldn't be held against him. Such a negative and defensive view of religion. Romney, on the other hand, said, no, my religion will help guide me as a president, and I'm not afraid of that. And religion is necessary to help guide our nation because it's what makes our freedom, what grounds our freedom, right? Our rights come from God, and we should not be afraid of that. Well, he didn't win the Republican nomination in 2008 or the presidency in 2012. In my opinion, candidate Romney did offer valuable service to the nation in this way. He defended the role of faith in public affairs, right? Because if a president doesn't need to be religious, but if a president is religious, one presumes that faith should guide his politics. I mean, it's very odd for a president to be religious and say, my faith doesn't matter. And I think Romney was quite intentionally both defending religious freedom, but also defending the role of faith in a candidate's life and in our national life. And though he didn't win the election, I think he deserves all of our applause for doing that. Not from running from his deepest commitments, but embracing them and encouraging the nation to embrace him because of those religious commitments. Now, whether or not that caused him the White House, hopefully we'll soon learn. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Philip and David, for this invitation to be here today. I'm going to follow Philip's example with maybe a point of personal privilege, if I might. So I'm here representing Utah Valley University, home of the Wolverines. I will say that in 71 years of history, we've never lost a football game. Those who are laughing know that we don't have a football team. That explains that stunning record. And I'm a BYU grad, as was noted, so I'll be cheering loudly for the Cougars. But I will say that one of my all-time favorite movies, our family, I'm here with my wife and children, one of our favorite family movies is Rudy. And this is a little unscripted, I may be in trouble, but Rudy is here today. Rudy, would you stand up and just let us applaud you? Well, there are implicitly two questions in the full title of today's panel. Did Mitt Romney's Mormonism cost him the White House? And then there was a subtitle about stained glass ceilings in American politics today. And so the question might be rephrased, did Mitt Romney's Mormonism cost him the election? Or did he break in some ways a stained glass ceiling in American politics? And what I'd like to suggest today is at some level the answers are yes and yes. So it wasn't that long ago that in this country, well, it was back right around 2000, that the New Republic published a very prominent issue of that publication, the cover story suggesting that America is still ruled by, quote, a Protestant presidency. And despite the fact that John F. Kennedy had broken the Catholic barrier, that often people would point to as saying that that had changed, as the writers of this essay pointed out, the only Catholic to follow Kennedy in the highest office since the 1960s was Josiah Bartlett, as played by Martin Sheen on The West Wing. So it hardly ushered in, well, as someone else put it, American presidential politics became as ecumenical as a Unitarian Seder. They go on to argue that if, and specifically, a Mormon were able to achieve the highest office in the land, the only way they thought it could happen is if they served as vice president first, sort of a bank shot. You serve 4 or 8 years, biding your time, and then maybe a Latter-day Saint could be elected to the highest office in the land. So Mitt Romney did not win, so maybe that thesis holds. And so what I'd like to say is something careful about the fact that I do think that religion played a role, not the role, but a role in his defeat. But that there is something that important that happened in American politics as a result of this candidacy that does suggest maybe a greater openness or opportunity for Latter-day Saints or other members of more minority faiths in the country for electoral success in American politics. So going into the campaign, of course, one of the big questions is what would happen with the evangelical vote. And according to the research done at the Pew Foundation, I'm not the real expert in these numbers. This is David is really truly one of the national scholars in these things. But just following almost avocationally, the Pew operation found that Romney took home 79% of the evangelical vote in 2012. That's as high as George W. Bush won in 2004, and it's higher than McCain won in 2008. So at some level, you have to say there was a big breakthrough there, or at least the sense that evangelicals would depart Romney in droves and be the decisive explanation in the election didn't really materialize. In fact, it was surprising how well ultimately Romney did with evangelical voters. But that said, I think that we have to look a little more carefully at just those numbers of what happened in the general election. You recall one of the important things that dogged Romney, especially during the primary phase, was that he was not, quote, conservative enough. And some colleagues of mine at some other institutions who have tracked this with their own tracking poll, they've done some scholarly research on, ran a battery of questions about this issue of conservatism, asking things like, does true conservatism mean supports small government, or supports individual liberty, or believes that right to life is the most important issue? One of the other questions they asked is being a true conservative mean being a true Christian guided by Christian beliefs and practices? Now, 62% of self-identified conservatives said yes to that last question about being a, quote, true Christian. Interestingly, self-described Mormon conservatives showed the lowest levels of support for such a statement. In fact, 56% of Mormons showed support for that statement. By contrast, evangelicals showed the highest support, indicating a rate at 80% that a true conservative means being a true Christian guided by Christian beliefs and practices. And the highest of all were the Southern evangelicals, who came in at 82%. So if Mitt Romney's Mormonism was not as prominent a feature in the headlines in 2008 as it was in 2004, or excuse me, 2008 as 2012 as it was in 2008, what these scholars show with some, I think, some really ingenious scholarship is that some of that may have been funneled by religious conservatives into not arguing about Mitt Romney's religion per se, but using this sort of moniker of conservatism. He's just not conservative enough. And this became a sort of a code speak for he's not really a true Christian. And so we have to be careful about, even if we see a changed rhetoric from 2008 to 2012, there may have been things going on in a subterranean way that were still very important and very driven by religious considerations. Beyond that, I think we also need to take stock of the fact that the primary was particularly bruising to Mitt Romney, maybe more so than any recent nominee in American politics. And where he had to kind of fight was on this issue. Was he conservative enough? And was he appealing to social conservatives? And he kept battling at every turn. And as one social conservative would get knocked down, another one would pop up. There had to be somebody other than Mitt Romney. And what this meant is that Romney had to do two things. One is he had to start defending himself in ways that I think another social conservative wouldn't have had to in a primary election. They would have saved those arguments. They would have saved that energy for the general election. But Mitt Romney was forced to do it all throughout the primary, answering to these attacks, answering to this criticism. It also meant he had to spend an inordinate amount of money in the primary phase to secure the primary election. And I have talked to a couple of people, very senior people, associated with the Romney campaign, who explain that one of the things that happened when Romney finally emerges as the victor coming out of the primary campaign and goes into the general election, you remember he got very criticized for going silent over the summer as the Obama campaign really kind of took to the airwaves and began to attack and paint the character and candidacy of Mitt Romney in a certain way, and there was no real response. And the general consensus was, well, it was just a flat-footed campaign. And what I've been told afterwards is that they were out of money, and they were recycling the money collecting operation coming out of the primary. They had spent everything defending themselves on that primary election. So these are things that almost happen in a secondary way that have a real drag on the campaign that I don't think has been fully articulated or understood at this point in the ways that it cost momentum and strength for Romney coming out of the primary into the general election. And then there is the general election. While I started earlier with some remarkably high statistics about evangelical support for Romney's election, there were some interesting exceptions to that, namely Ohio. So in Ohio, Romney had a more difficult time convincing evangelicals in particular. There, McCain earned 71% of the evangelical vote, and Romney got 68%. So where he outstrips McCain in a general sense across the electorate by quite a ways, in Ohio, one of those crucial states, he loses by 3%. And so I think the picture here is just a lot more complicated and subtle than maybe we experienced at first blush the morning after the election. And so my conclusion is it's not the explaining factor. There may be other things going on. There were other things going on, but it certainly did play a part. Now, having said that, I'd like to conclude with this note, which is one gigantic fact remains. Mitt Romney almost won this election. Obama won 332 electoral votes to Romney's 206, and that seems like quite a sweep. But in the popular vote, Obama won 50%, 50.6% to Romney's 47.8%. Now, compared to the truly razor-thin margins of a Bush v. Gore, that may sound like not such a tight race. But consider this: between 1990 and 1999, or excuse me, 1900 and 1999, only 5 of the 25 presidential elections were decided by fewer than 130 electoral votes. Only 3 had popular vote margins smaller than the Obama-Romney contest. A shift of just a few 100,000 votes out of millions in a handful of battleground states, and the outcome would have been very different. So Mitt Romney didn't win. Maybe the original thesis about you've got to, if you're LDS and on your way to the presidency, it has to be through a vice presidency. The problem is that we're still sorting through this, and the fact is that it wasn't just the religion that was at issue in this campaign, and it may have been a little hurdle or part of a hurdle, but it wasn't the hurdle. But what I think we look at with the very close margin by which Romney lost that campaign is that he was remarkably successful in American politics. We're in a different place today than we were when the New Republic ran its cover story in 2000. And so I think the future for LDS candidates, or again candidates from other minority faiths, is not having nearly the same hurdles, and that may be reassuring to a broad swath of Americans that a Mormon or a member of another lesser-known faith can be trusted with the highest office of the land. And if that's true, that is not an insignificant transformation of American political culture. So, thank you.
Well, thank you, Philip and Matt, for your comments. I'm David Campbell. You might recall I was the first of the 3 speakers introduced. I'm the one with the divided loyalties because I'm a BYU alum. But I teach here at Notre Dame. I just want everyone to know my wife, who's also a BYU alum, when Notre Dame plays BYU, it's rather charming. She actually cheers for both teams. And I keep telling her she has to pick a side, but she continues to cheer for both teams. And in my case, in my career, I always feel like I am a fish out of water. I teach at Notre Dame, and I'm not Catholic. I teach about American politics. I'm actually not an American. I'm a Canadian. Yeah. So what this means is a few years ago, I was on a roundtable, not unlike this one, on the topic of Catholics in American politics. And so I started my remarks with what passes for a joke among political scientists when I said to the crowd, I'm here to talk about Catholics in American politics, but if you're willing to listen to what a non-Catholic, non-American has to say about Catholics in American politics, stick around. Ha, ha, ha. Well, the next day, the campus newspaper, The Observer, had that roundtable as the front page story. That's what passes for news at Notre Dame. And the opening sentence of the story said, yesterday, Professor David Campbell, neither a Catholic nor an American, said, blah, da, 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 da. But as I look out at all this wave of blue and the Y everywhere I see, I'm not even sure there are any Notre Dame people here. So maybe for what? Oh, there are a few. All right. I'm just going to talk very briefly about what the empirical data shows regarding Election Day, and did, in the end, Romney's Mormonism actually affect his performance at the polls. And Matt has already telegraphed a little bit of that by talking about how the evangelical constituency across the nation seemed to be willing to vote for Mitt Romney, even if there might have been pockets, like in the state of Ohio, where he didn't do quite as well as he might have hoped or expected. One thing to keep in mind is, even though we generally talk about a candidate's or Mitt Romney's religious background as being a detriment, it's actually also conceivable that it could be a plus for him, at least among some constituencies. Obviously, he did very well among the Mormon vote, but the very fact that he had an R next to his name actually kind of explains that one. But it's also entirely possible that there would be other people in the country who are actually drawn to Romney because of his religious background. So my co-authors and I, who are just about to publish a book on the broad subject of Mormons in American politics, so not just about Mitt Romney, although that's part of our story. We actually did a big survey in October 2012, so just before the general election, in which we asked people a whole series of questions about Mormons and other religious groups tapping into what you might think would be either positive or negative stereotypes associated with those religious groups. That included Catholics and Jews and Muslims and then, of course, Mormons. And so we were able to actually see how people had both positive and negative perceptions of those different groups, including Mormons. And we were able to see whether or not people's perceptions of Mormons, both positive and negative, had any bearing on their support for Mitt Romney. And perhaps not surprisingly, if you had a negative view of Mormons, you were much less likely to vote for Mitt Romney. And if you had a positive view of Mormons, you were much more likely to vote for Mitt Romney. And for the most part, whether or not you had a positive or a negative perception of Mormons actually was related pretty strongly to whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. And so for the most part, that actually wasn't going to make much difference at the polls. But there was a tiny fraction of Democrats who said, actually, we have a pretty positive perception of Mormons, and they were very, very likely to support Romney. There just weren't very many of them. And similarly, no, in all seriousness, and similarly, there was actually a relatively small number of Republicans who had a very negative view of Mormons, and they were not going to vote for Romney. It wasn't so much that they were going to vote for Obama. In their case, they would just actually stay home and not turn out at all. So we can actually say that there were some voters, there were some pockets of voters for which Romney's Mormonism was either a plus or a minus, but they were a relatively small pocket, and as Matt suggested, probably not enough to sway the election one way or the other. But the fact that those perceptions of Mormons were so closely related to whether you are a Democrat or Republican actually enables me to make another point. We pitched this as a panel on whether or not Romney's Mormonism affected his political prospects. But I'd like to suggest that Romney might have actually had an effect on people's perceptions of Mormons. Now, I'm going to bet that there are a few Mormons in the audience, so some of you may already know that when you take a look at all the different religious groups in America and how they're perceived by other Americans, it turns out that Mormons don't actually rate very highly on that scale. You're going to think I'm just saying this to suck up to my bosses at Notre Dame, but it turns out Catholics and Jews are the two groups in America that are the most positively perceived. Mormons are not at the very bottom. It turns out atheists are viewed more negatively than are Mormons, as are Muslims. But Mormons are kind of at the bottom of this scale. And I won't go into the details of how we measure this, but just sort of trust me that this is a method that's been used by social scientists over the years. It's known as a feeling thermometer, and what this graph shows you is how that perception of Mormons has held more or less steady from 2006 to 2012. Now that's pretty remarkable. What happened in between here? Well, Mitt Romney appeared on the national stage. Mormon Church took a huge PR hit for its involvement in Proposition 8 in California. There was a certain Broadway musical some of you might have heard of. David Archuleta almost won American Idol. Stephanie Meyer became a best-selling author. Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game has come out. All of that happened over that period, and the perception of Mormons stayed flat. So that would suggest that maybe all these cultural and political happenings that some have called the Mormon moment really haven't had much to do with how Americans perceive Mormons as a group. But actually, the story's a little more complicated, because when you break those perceptions out by people's partisanship, that is, whether they identify as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, you see something very interesting. Back in 2006, when we first collected these data, whether you were a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent had nothing to do with how you perceived Mormons. But as you can see, as we get closer and closer to 2012, those lines begin to split. And what does that mean? Well, it means that by the time you get to the post-election survey we did in 2012, so this is roughly December 2012, if you're a Republican, you have a much more positive perception of Mormons than if you are an independent or a Democrat. Now, you might be saying, well, perhaps that's not surprising, given that Mitt Romney was the Republican standard bearer, and we had just come through a very close and contested election. But this is nonetheless a quite remarkable finding, because it suggests that we have this tight connection between how people perceive their politics and how they perceive a particular religious group in the country. Now, we don't know whether or not this will continue. It may be that this was just a temporary, fleeting thing, and there will be enough, other Mormon politicians pop up on the Democratic aisle. Maybe there'll be lots of little Harry Reids running around, and everyone will forget that, oh yeah, it turned out in 2012 the Republican nominee was a Mormon. But given that Mormons themselves are overwhelmingly Republican, that doesn't seem terribly likely. It's possible that just the memory of 2012 will fade, and those lines will close in again, and everyone will sort of again forget that there was sort of any political implication to Mormonism. Maybe. But maybe not. And I would suggest to those who are Latter-day Saints in the audience that this is actually a bit of a challenge for members of the LDS Church, because it probably makes it more difficult for the LDS Church to do the things that it wants to do if it is perceived in political or at least partisan terms. I don't know what the solution is to that, but it definitely could at least turn out to be a challenge. So I will close my remarks with this summary. While, as I think has been the consensus among us today, Mormonism may not have affected Mitt, at least not much, Mitt appears to have affected perceptions of Mormonism. Thank you. Now, I believe the plan here is if anyone wants to ask a question or two, we're happy to stick around. We won't go past 1 o'clock in our formal session here, although we're able to stick around a little bit longer than that and just chat if people are interested. Or some people may just want to leave right now, apparently. But anyway, if anyone does have a question, feel free to stand up, identify yourself, and ask away. In the back, please.
I got a numbers question. I assume some people voted for Mitt Romney because he was a Mormon?
Yes.
A positive effect?
Yes.
And some people voted against him?
Yep.
To what degree did those numbers offset each other?
That's a good question. As I was saying...
I wouldn't have asked it otherwise.
Because those perceptions are so closely related to people's partisanship or their party preference, we're talking about relatively small numbers. But it turns out they're about equal. So they were kind of offsetting, which is actually something to keep in mind. Again, that there were people who seemed attracted to Romney because of his religion, and not just people who were drawn away from him because of his religion. And that's part of the story that didn't really get told during the 2012 campaign. So thank you for that question.
Holland and Deseret News. I want to talk about substance for just a moment in terms of substantive positions. It's hard to think of a substantive social policy where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has had as much a voice in recent years. There are kind of two. The marriage debate, so certainly with Prop 8, but also in the state of Utah, issues around immigration. And so during 2010-2011, the LDS Church clearly telegraphs a very moderate position on immigration, emphasizing issues of family and compassion, and these are the kinds of things that come through in several official statements. It seems to me that if you look at the 2012 election, where Romney has his hardest issue in the general election is with the Hispanic. And it seems that you could say that he's taken a position that seems to be outside the official position of the faith. And I'm just wondering if there's any comment on how, his dance on that issue vis-a-vis, the conservative base during the primary, and then how that comes into the election may have played in it. And if whether his Mormonism, had he been truer to his Mormonism, if he could have had a better showing in the general election?
Yeah, it's terribly ironic that on the, as Paul has noted, the one issue where Romney could credibly say, really, look, I'm speaking differently than my church, happens to be the issue where the church is to the left of Romney. But that's the way politics goes. So I agree with you 100% that actually the LDS Church, and this is, for those who are not LDS in the audience, a little known fact, I think, nationally, that the LDS Church is actually quite, I don't know if I dare say liberal, I might get things thrown at me, but moderate on the issue of immigration. Dieter Uchtdorf, who's one of the first presidency, that's one of the three leaders of the top leaders of the LDS Church, actually had a meeting with President Obama a few months ago on the subject of immigration, and came out of the meeting, held a press conference, and said, yeah, actually we agree with the administration's policies on immigration. He's not actually an American either, so in Mormon circles he kind of gets a pass. But anyway, so it's an interesting point to make about immigration and the fact that Romney did run to the right of his church on that particular issue. I would say this is what happens when somebody enters the national political scene. I don't think there was any choice for Romney but to take the kind of position that he did in the Republican primary, just because that issue is so hot and so contested that if you're a Republican and you want to win the nomination in a Tea Party infused primary electorate, you've got to say pretty harsh things about immigration, and that's what he, I guess, felt he had to do.
Dave, if I might, Gingrich, though, felt much at liberty to take a more moderate position. And so in the, as they're coming into the Georgia primaries, Gingrich talks about, a more moderated approach to dealing with the issue, and felt that there was liberty to do that. His poll, and it didn't seem to hurt him initially in the next few primaries after that. Gingrich actually had some votes.
Of course, he lost.
And if there's one thing we know about Newt Gingrich, he definitely feels at liberty to say a lot of things. So
let's see if we can get a couple more questions here in the hat. Yep.
A comment about what happened in the summer you mentioned. The Wall Street Journal had an article about the same thing. Romney really didn't raise enough money, like $1 billion isn't enough money. And having worked on the Romney campaign in Washington, D.C., we saw Romney there at fundraisers 5, 6, 7 times, and he raised a ton of money. But what about the fact that he wasn't out in Ohio or Virginia shaking hands when he was spending so much time raising money? I appreciate a comment on that. I think it's know the real Romney, in my view, anyway.
Yeah, well, I think that takes us into a larger analysis about the Romney campaign, which is certainly connected and relevant, because I think has been underscored here. It wasn't just the religious issue. There are all sorts of things that we might look at in terms of the Romney campaign, and clearly I think in retrospect now. There was a ground game on the Obama versus Romney campaign where where the Romney group got out campaigned, and from organizing to getting out the vote to a little harder to assess the press the flesh of the actual candidate himself quotient, but that could have played into it. But I think you're on the right path to say there are some other things that if you're really looking at why he didn't succeed, it would take you beyond the religious question to the mechanics of campaigning.
Let's see if we can squeeze two or three more questions in if we have them. It's a little hard to see. There's a lady in the back, please. Oh, sorry.
One comment or thing that I noticed about the excerpts with Kennedy versus Romney was that, at least in what we saw, Romney did not say what religion he had, whereas the Catholicism was clearly stated many times from the excerpt that we saw. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. You mean, everyone knows, of course, that Romney's Mormon, and the excerpts are just that. But if you look at his speech in total, the aim of his speech is to say that I embrace my religion, but my religion, its political teachings are the same as the common moral tradition of America. You know, we believe that our rights come from God. We have duties to neighbor, right? And so he, this is not my particular subject matter of my scholarship, but he was embracing what it seems to me a more general trend of Mormonism, that I'm a mainstream, I fit in the mainstream of Christianity, was the larger theme, a larger theme of the speech.
He did mention the fact that he was Mormon, but just once in the speech. And he also makes this interesting turn in that speech in which he says, I'm Mormon, and then he actually, and the Latter-day Saints in the audience will know exactly what I'm talking about. He then bears his testimony, if you want to use Mormon language. He testifies of his belief in Jesus Christ as his Savior, and then he says, but I don't want to talk about the distinctive doctrines of my faith. That's where he stops it. So he was basically opening the door to the commonality that he would share with others, at least of a Christian background in the U.S., but then didn't want to go any further than that and talk about, you know, the peculiarities that come along with his Mormonism.
Certainly.
A related question, I guess, we're talking about 50-year difference in time between those two stances on sharing your faith, your belief. How much of the difference do you think between President Kennedy and Mitt Romney is explained by time differences versus how much of it is pitching to your individual parties, with Romney having to see kind of a religious vote versus Kennedy perhaps not being focused on that?
You know, it's a good point. And, you know, there are particular criticisms that Kennedy was trying to defend against. I mean, it's actually quite interesting if you look at, just taught this in class, if you read the editorials of Christianity Today, which is Billy Graham's magazine of the in early 1960, they ran an editorial saying to be bigoted against Catholics is legitimate, it's reasonable, because Catholics can't be trusted with political office. Right. I mean, it's striking. My students were just dumbfounded that this, you know, all they know is Notre Dame's on NBC and everyone loves Notre Dame.
That's true.
And, you know, and so Kennedy's speech was directed towards those particular concerns, and Romney's speech was directed to other particular concerns. But Romney does say, you know, if I lose this election on account of my faith, he says, literally, so be it. Right. Which I was quite impressed in rereading that speech to see that. You know, there's a young gentleman here. Please.
Yes, my name is John Vernon. I'm a student here. I am a senior. I'll be graduating soon. My question is, on your study and your information, I'm going to break down with demographics by age. So was the youth perceptions of Mormonism, did that determine party lines or whatnot? So I'm just curious about your response on that.
That's a good question. There aren't any strong age effects in perceptions of Mormonism. And it's because there are sort of two countervailing factors. On the one hand, young people are just generally more likely to be tolerant of any group that you might define as the other. So you might think, well, that would mean they would be warmer toward Mormons, but then cutting against that is because Mormonism is associated with an anti-gay position, that actually is something that can also be a concern to many young people. So those two factors kind of cancel each other out, and you end up with young people looking a lot like everybody else.
David, I just want to ask a personal question. Being on campus here at Notre Dame and LDS, during that whole process, do you get a lot of questions? How do people perceive you, and did your perception of others change at all?
Oh, let me tell you, journalists, they can't resist the Mormon at Notre Dame. So, yes, I did get a lot of queries. And actually, the LDS Church's Public Affairs Department, I don't know whether I'm happy about this, but they often refer reporters to me because I'm the Mormon at Notre Dame, so that's kind of exciting. Although I can quite honestly say, and I do mean this, not just because this is being recorded and administrators from Notre Dame might see it. In all honesty, our president at Notre Dame, Father John Jenkins, has a saying that I think is actually really powerful. He speaks of Notre Dame being a Catholic university, both in a capital C sense, that's the way everybody sort of recognizes, right? That's why we have a 14-story mural of Jesus on the library. But to be Catholic in a capital C sense, we also must be Catholic in a lowercase c sense, meaning a universal campus. And I can honestly say, and I think I can speak for faculty here who are not Catholic but not LDS, so those of other faiths, that this is a totally welcoming place and it's never been an issue. And that was true during the 2012 campaign. It was true before that, and I'm sure it'll be true going forward.
Dr. Shumway from San Diego. I just have a question with regards vis-a-vis Mitt Romney and JFK. As far as numbers are concerned, what do we have, 5 or 6 million U.S. Mormons at the time of Romney's running? But how many in percentage or how many millions of Catholics were there in 1960?
Anyone know?
They were a little less than 25% of the population in 1960. So whatever the U.S. population would have been, divide that into quarters, and that's so far more. And that's actually one of the key differences between the Kennedy situation. So Kennedy, in spite of the fact that, again, we focused on the possible negatives associated with his religion, he actually did benefit from his religion as well. There's a rather famous piece written by some political scientists in the 60s that sort of showed that Kennedy did a little better than you would have expected in Catholic areas, and specifically in Irish Catholic areas. So we forget there was an ethnic element to the Kennedy aura, as well as the religious element.
Sir, right here.
I'm also a citizen of the North Border, and our perspective was that since the Kennedy election, religion has become a bigger and bigger issue. Would you say that it's way more today than it did back in the early 60s?
I mean, that's your research.
The question is, does religion matter more now than it did in 1960 when Kennedy was running? I would say yes, or at the very least it matters differently. So what mattered in Kennedy's day was the fact that he was Catholic. I don't think it comes as too much of a shock to say that he wasn't a terribly devout Catholic. But that wasn't the issue. It was just simply that he was Catholic. Jackie Kennedy used to joke that she thought it was hilarious that Jack's Catholicism was an issue, because as she used to put it, it's not like he ever goes to Mass or anything. What's different now is rather than a coalition of, say, Catholics versus Protestants, what you have are highly religious people of whatever faith who have sort of formed a coalition versus people who are not very religious or secular on the other side. And increasingly the parties, that is the Democrats and the Republicans, are divided along the lines of how religious you are rather than the particular flavor of religion that you have.
Do you want to add anything? Okay, maybe one more?
Yeah, so thank you for your guys' presentation. It's been great, especially the comedy. So my question is, could Romney and even the Republican Party have done things differently to attract the Latino vote? Obviously, that's what made the biggest difference in this election, right? I mean, it certainly impacted the Obama re-election. So what could they do moving forward? Because Latinos, socially we're conservative, right? At a lot of levels, we have sort of the Catholic connection as well. So can you speak to that?
Well, I think it's a nice question, and it dovetails the line of questioning from Paul, which is, could Romney have hit a little different register, not just on the Hispanic issue, but on other conservative issues or issues that were at stake in the campaign? And I think the answer is yes. I think the Republicans can speak to that, and they'll have to. If the party wants to have hope of electoral success moving forward. And it's just, I do think Romney was there in a point of time that was particularly vexing from where he was. I think if you strip back the inherent sort of pressures of that campaign, and you just looked at Mitt Romney, the man, and the guy who ran in Massachusetts, and what his sort of natural instincts and flares might have been, I think you'd have seen a warmer disposition to some of these other issues, and he may have done better than that. It's just so hard to say, because that was the immigration issue was such an intense issue, especially at that moment. I think even more so than now, and yet I think part of the issue that Romney faced was what some people sensed was perhaps a gap between the rhetoric or the stances he took in the primary election and where people thought he might have been as a candidate individually, and that raised some authenticity questions and issues that dogged him throughout the campaign. Could he have dialed back to been closer to things that he may or may not, that he believed in? Would he have scored more on the authenticity front? Probably. Would that have cost him votes with primary conservatives and delegates who were insistent on a particular position? Probably. So it's really hard to say how that would play out in Mitt Romney's case, but I do think moving forward, successful Republicans are going to have to figure out how to navigate that.
To all three speakers, a great